You should now have completed the centre triangle of the shawl. This is obviously just a very small sample, and the next step now is to pick up stitches through all these yarn over loops that we have either side of the triangle. At the top here I've got all the stitches on a thread being held, apart from the very first stitch, well, the last stitch worked, which I've put onto a locking stitch marker. So with the right side facing me, I'm going to place that first stitch onto my needle, and then I'm going to pick up these loops from front to back all the way down the triangle. So in the pattern it tells you exactly the number of loops that you should have coming down the side. So if I just briefly go back up to the top here, you've got, let's just go back up to the top here, because I realise I missed the very first one. So we've got our stitch from the stitch marker here, and then you do need to pick up that very first loop. So in fact I'm actually going to pick that one up the opposite way around to make sure it stays on the needle, and then that very first loop here, and then we're going to carry on pricking up one stitch, and as you can see I'm going from front to back through the loops all the way down to the point where we started the shawl. So I've picked up, and according to the pattern you should then have 95 loops down to that point. We then need to pick up one loop right at the bottom, and then again we're going to carry on and picking up one loop in the same way again, still from front to back, up the other side of the triangle. So we're simply picking up loops at the moment. So I've nearly got back up to the top here, and you should have the same number of loops up the second side as you had down the first. So we get to, and when we get up to the top we've got that one last loop here as well, so don't miss this last loop here. So I've now picked up all the way around the edge of the bottom triangle, or the centre triangle. I'm now going to come back to where we started picking up. So this is still the right side facing me, and I've now moved my knitting around so that I'm now back at the beginning of this row, and I can now work the row. So you're working this row with your contrast colour. Let me just pick all my bits up. So I'm going to work that very first stitch, and now one of the things I want to point out is that as you were picking up your stitches from front to back, if you look at the way they're sitting on this left needle, they're mounted the opposite way to normal. Normally when you look at a stitch it would be mounted so that this front leg here, or this right hand leg, is at the front, and at the moment it's at the back. As we work this row of stitches, you can decide how you want this join to look. The stitches can either be worked through the front of the loop, which would be to come round here, and that will give you a twist to give you a crossed look, or it can be worked through the back of the loop, which will give you an open hole. What I'm going to do is I'm going to work the first half down to the point as a crossed stitch, and then I'm going to work the second half as an open stitch to give you an idea of what it looks like. So I'm going to work down this side of the shawl into every stitch, and this time on this side, let me just pull this yarn out of the way, I'm working the equivalent of a twisted stitch. So I'm going to knit into the front of the loop, which twists the stitch. So we're working down here. When I get to the bottom, I'll put the knitting down so that you can see how the knitting looks on that side. So I'm coming down, and again I could have, as I came down to the points down there, I should have suggested that you put a locking stitch marker or a split pin marker into that center point stitch. It just makes life easier if you know exactly which is the stitch at the point. So I've got one more stitch to work, which I'm doing as a twisted stitch, and I think that's my stitch at the point, and then this is the second half. So I'm just going to put this half down first, and if you look at the knitting, you should be able to see that I've got this kind of twisted lattice look to the stitches. I'm now going to work the other side, and I've got my yarn out of the way. So I'm going to work that centre stitch, working through the back loop. Make sure my yarn tail is at the back, and this side I'm going to work all the stitches through the back loop, so that on this side you can see the alternative way of joining to start this next section. So as I'm coming up, I'm working through the back loop to give it an open, much more open stitch, which will give you a much clearer eyelet hole on the way up this edge. So I've got worked all the way up to the top of that side. So if I now lay this edge down, you can see now that these are a much clearer hole. So this, if you work through the back of the loop, you'll get a nice open eyelet hole pattern. If you work through the front of the loop, you will get a twisted lattice look pattern. Once you've picked out your stitches and worked that first row, You'll then continue to follow the pattern, which will give you an increase row, and then we'll start taking you into the old shale stitch pattern. So that's how to pick up your loops from your centre triangle and then work the first row in whichever method you prefer to use.